Alex, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be with you. And thank you, friends of the National World War II Memorial. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to be able to talk about the life of a remarkable American, Ben Kuroki. The name of the book is Most Honorable Son, and I came up with that title because that was Ben's nickname, his first bomber crew serving in Europe and North Africa with the 93rd Bomb Group. What I would like to do is to touch on really the highlights of Ben's life, and we can really break his life down into about six parts. So you have the backstory, the formative years, Ben's military service, his involvement in the Japanese incarceration tragedy in the U.S. during the war, his 59th mission tour, which was this remarkable tour, largely self-funded after World War II. And then he became a journalist and had a remarkable 30-year career as a journalist. And then this really extraordinary long goodbye, 10 years, the final 10 years of his life of receiving all these accolades. But for me, the story really began with the story of my uncle, who was lost in World War II, who was a B-24 gunner, who served with the 93rd Bomb Group, part of the 8th Air Force. And it turned out that this was the same outfit that Ben Kuroki had served with. And I had heard bits and fragments of that story growing up from my mother and my grandfather. And this photograph shows my uncle on his final home leave in April 1943 before deploying to England, and my mother at the front left, my grandfather. So this was really where the roots of this story began for me. And in the course of visiting my grandmother, she had a book that was about one of the famous raids that my uncle L.H. had flown on, and it was the low-level Ploesti raid, the Romanian oil fields that were the primary source of Hitler's oil during the war. And in that book, about 25 pages into this marvelous 50-page photo insert, was this photograph. And this was my first introduction to Ben Kuroki. So I had Ben's story kicking around in my head really from childhood. And as I explored my uncle's story and started trying to write about his service, his life, and his death in World War II, I kept bumping into Ben Kuroki's story. And eventually I came to tell Ben's story. And that really took me deep into this remarkable world of Ben Kuroki. Ben, at the time of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Ben was in his mid-20s, about 24 years old. He had grown up on a Nebraska farm, the sixth of 10 children born to Japanese immigrants. His father had immigrated to the U.S. in 1904. His mother, about 3 years later, she was a picture bride. So this was the forerunner of mail order brides, and she had come over to marry Shisuke Kuroki sight unseen, and Shisuke was working for the Union Pacific Railroad. And that's how he eventually got to Nebraska and became a farmer in the Platte River Valley in western Nebraska. And so that's where Ben grew up. Ben in this photograph is the second from left. He grew up on the farm, working hard, and learned by the time that he got out of high school that he did not want to spend the rest of his life on the farm. So Ben had bought a produce truck with a friend, had scraped together some money, and they were driving produce into Lincoln, Nebraska, and Omaha then to Oklahoma, and then all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. They would bring back citrus. They would take vegetables, potatoes, and things that they were growing on their Nebraska farm and deliver those. And December 7th, 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Ben would later say this was the first time in his life that he was ashamed of his Japanese ancestry. He immediately decided, talking with his brother Fred, that he had to enlist, that he had to reclaim the family's honor by serving in combat. And so Ben got his father's blessing the next day, Monday, December 8th, tried to enlist in the Marine Corps, got turned away because there was great uncertainty whether or not Japanese Americans would be welcome to serve in the armed forces after what had happened at Pearl Harbor. After a few days of trying, Ben drove 150 miles each way, not once, but twice, to Grand Island, Nebraska, to enlist in the U.S. Army Air Forces. In early 1942, Ben began his military career. Within a few days, his brother Fred was pulled out of the outfit and sent to a regular Army unit to dig ditches and trenches, and Ben went on alone. Now, from the opening moments of their military service, from the train ride from the fort in Wyoming, where they were sworn in, to basic training in Texas, Shepherd Field outside of Wichita Falls, Texas, Ben experienced bigotry, racism, epithets, sneers, dirty looks. This was shocking to Ben because in his little corner of the world where he grew up in rural Nebraska, Hershey, Nebraska, about 14 miles west of North Platte, Ben hadn't experienced these sorts of things. So this was a terribly trying, very disconcerting time for him. He stuck it out. He made it through basic training. He went to clerical school in Colorado, was then assigned to Barksdale Field in northwest Louisiana. And it was there that Ben was assigned to the 93rd Bomb Group, which was a B-24 outfit that was taking shape, that had been earmarked to be sent to England to join the 8th Air Force and to carry out, or to be one of the units carrying out the daylight bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. Ben, during this period, a couple of times, bigoted sergeants tried to get him thrown out of the 93rd. The first time before they went to Florida to complete their training, and then the second time before they deployed to England. Now, Ben was assigned in the 93rd as a teletype operator. Even though they didn't have teletype machines, they had to do something with the clerks. This is a wonderful photo taken of Ben in Florida, the Florida summer heat. Ben was so eager to serve in combat that he was thrilled to be able to try on a leather flying suit. So I love this photograph because you can see the enthusiasm, again, Ben's single-minded focus on serving in combat, proving his patriotism, proving his Americanism. Ben got over to England in September of 1942. The ground echelon actually went by boat, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, and then they were posted to a little village outside of Cambridge, Alconbury, and that's where the 93rd Bomb Group was based. Ben was still not in combat duty, but he kept pestering his senior officers and got a transfer into the armament section, which would allow him to hang around the flight line. Got to know pilots, finally was sent off for gunnery training, and in December of 1942, Ben joined a crew. This photograph was taken after Ben was getting an audition of sorts with one crew, and he was so thrilled by his first training flight up in a B-24 that he insisted on posing for a photograph with the crew of Wham Bam in this photo here. So Ben joined a combat crew in the 93rd, just on the eve of the 93rd being sent to North Africa to fly missions in support of the Operation Torch landings in the fall of 1942. So the 93rd, three of the four squadrons were dispatched to North Africa. And over the course of 2+ months, Ben flew his first 14 combat missions. This photograph shows a 93rd crew, not Ben's crew, but this was the typical arrangement, the living conditions being briefed. They were living in tents in the desert, being briefed on a chalkboard for the day's mission. And during this period, Ben they were bombing German ports in North Africa and some in Italy as well. This shows the 93rd crew gearing up for a mission. So Ben flew his 14 missions in North Africa. On the way back to England, Ben and his crew had a near-death experience when they had mechanical problems. They were flying in storms and fog and had to make an emergency landing in a wheat field in the Atlas Mountains and ended up being interned in Spain for 2 or 3 months. They landed in Spanish Morocco, then rejoined the 93rd in May of 1943 and resumed flying. Now, keep in mind the life of a bomber crew member, particularly in 1943, they were flying without escorts. So they were flying long distances over enemy territory without long-range fighter escorts. Close calls, you were constantly facing enemy anti-aircraft fire, enemy fighter attacks. And so Ben and his crew lost a lot of friends, lost a lot of comrades, and had their own close calls. One of the most remarkable close calls happened in May of 1943. Ben had just rejoined the 93rd, and they were flying a raid on German submarine pens at La Palisse, France, on the coast of France. They were at about, I believe it was around 22,000 feet at the time. All four engines went out. Plane went into a dive, plummeted to 2,000 feet. So they were just seconds from crashing into the Bay of Biscay when the pilot managed to get the engines restarted and pulled out of it. Back at base later, after that mission, the crews would be debriefed by an intelligence officer. And the intelligence officer wrote a notation at the bottom of their debriefing report: 10 nervous wrecks, candidates for rest home. So imagine doing this day after day after day after day, going up in these very fragile aircraft, thin aluminum skin, being shot at, doing combat with German fighters. And then in this photograph of seeing the horror of all horrors was the low-level Ploesti raid of August 1st, 1943, which Ben flew. This was the Ploesti, Romania oil fields. Ben and his crew survived this, but they lost a lot of friends. And the cumulative effect of the stress of losing friends, of flying these missions, began to weigh on Ben. Now, Ben finished 25 missions in Europe. That wasn't enough. He felt he needed to do more. He wanted to fly 5 for his brother Fred, who wasn't allowed to serve in combat, so he flew 5 more missions. Took him a couple of months to fly those 2 more missions. Weather stand-downs, various problems. But on his 30th mission, a raid on Munster, Germany, Ben once again was nearly killed. He had a top turret shattered around his head. And so he posed for this photograph afterward of the near miss. Ben returned to the U.S., a hero. A lot of articles were written about him. A young reporter had come out from London to write a profile on him, a reporter by the name of Walter Cronkite. And so Ben returned to the States, a hero. Ben was determined to fly a tour in the Pacific. He felt that flying the tour in Europe and North Africa wasn't enough, and so he continued to lobby the Army Air Forces and the War Department to be sent to the Pacific, and that finally happened in the fall of 1944. He was assigned to a B-29 crew and was deployed to Tinian in December of 1944. Now, Ben had to get a special dispensation, a written dispensation from Secretary of War Henry Stimson to be allowed to serve in the Pacific. He was the only American of Japanese ancestry to fly combat missions in the Pacific. So this was Ben's new home, Tinian, Northfield, and he proceeded to fly 28 missions as a B-29 gunner. He flew the 3 of the firebombing raids against Tokyo, including the first one, the March 9th, 10th raid, 1945, and then ultimately went on to fly 28 missions in the Pacific. This was Ben being interviewed by the Fighting AAF radio show after his 27th mission in the Pacific. Ben was on Tinian on the morning of August 6th, 1945, when this aircraft, the Enola Gay, took off in the pre-darkness, bombed Hiroshima, and then landed at Northfield. Ben returned to the States, and I'll touch more on his life in the post-war period. But first, I want to talk very briefly about Ben during that period after returning from Europe, before deploying to the Pacific, came face to face with the incarceration tragedy, the incarceration of more than 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast, the so-called exclusion zone, who were seen as security risks. And when Ben came back, he delivered a remarkable speech in February 1944 before the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. And he talked about the camaraderie and different backgrounds of all the men on his crews that had come together and pulled together and fought together and died together. And he delivered that message and spoke out against what was happening to people of Japanese ancestry in this country. Only a few weeks later, then, Ben was sent by the War Department to recruit young Americans of Japanese ancestry to fight in the Army. And so he went to 3 camps. It was a very painful duty for Ben because some people welcomed him as a hero. This was at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. People turning out. You can see a handwritten sign over on the left, Welcome Sergeant Kuroki. A lot of people treated Ben as the hero he was. He delivered speeches. He signed autographs. But Ben also came face to face with young men who had organized a draft resistance movement, who were very angry over losing their civil rights, their constitutional rights, and they refused to serve until those rights were restored. And they viewed Ben as the face, as a collaborator, as the face of the government that had stripped them of their rights. And so he encountered some very unpleasant moments during these tour of the camps. And so Ben was very glad then to have the opportunity to go and serve in the Pacific and to essentially move on from this painful chapter in his war. When Ben returned from the Pacific in 1945, he embarked on a remarkable phase of his life, which he called the 59th Mission Tour. He spoke for about a year and a half, delivered speeches to civic groups. He was in wide demand for interviews. He talked about winning the peace. And Ben's message was, we've won the war, we came together, and now at home we need to address some of the inequities at home, socioeconomic inequities, racial inequities. And so he delivered speeches. He was interviewed. This was Ben appearing on CBS radio. This was Ben with a school group. And it was an extraordinary moment. And he loved being out and meeting people and delivering these talks. This was signing autographs on the 59th mission tour. Now, Ben, the next phase of his life, he returned to Nebraska, studied to become a journalist, owned some weekly newspapers, and then in the mid 1960s, after owning newspapers in Nebraska, Idaho, and Michigan, moved to California with his family and had an extraordinary career with the Ventura County newspaper as a news editor. Been retired from journalism in 1982 and was content with a life of golf. But World War II started to reappear in his memories. Now, people who knew Ben during those years, during his years in journalism, didn't know about his life as a World War II bomber crew member and as a hero. But in 1991, that changed when the 50th anniversary ceremonies of World War II started occurring. And the Nebraska State History Museum asked Ben to come back to Lincoln and to deliver the keynote address opening their 50th anniversary ceremony, or their 50th anniversary celebration and their exhibition. It was a remarkable time for Ben. He thought it was the pinnacle of his career, and he thought it was his last hurrah. He once again faded into sort of a private, quiet life. But his old crewmates and old comrades in the 93rd Bomb Group continued to feel that full justice had never been done to Ben and his service. And so in 2005, they succeeded in getting Ben the Distinguished Service Medal. That set in motion a decade-long series of honors, public appearances, White House appearances. This was Ben around 2007, I believe, where he was a guest of President George W. Bush and First Lady Laura Bush at the Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi state dinner. So this was Ben. His wife, Shige, is on the far right in this photograph, and then his youngest daughter, Julie, who became Ben's friend, advisor, and really the person who made this long goodbye, these final 10 years happen for him. So there was a documentary film made about Ben's life using Most Honorable Son, his nickname from his first crew, and then this very emotional moment for Ben of where his final White House appearance, George W. Bush coming down and a tearful Ben greeting each other after a very warm introduction by President George W. Bush. Ben lived to the age of 98. He died in 2015, and a wonderful New York Times obituary honored him as a great American patriot, a great war hero. And for me, being able to tell the story of Ben Kuroki and to preserve the remarkable story of a remarkable American is certainly one of the highlights of my writing life. And so I've thoroughly enjoyed this journey of going deep into Ben's life and telling his story. I look forward now to answering your questions. Thanks very much.
Hi, Greg. How are you?
Hi, Alex. How are you? It's great to be with you.
Yeah, it's wonderful to meet you virtually finally. I just wanted to say it's a beautiful book. One of the really pleasant things about today for me is that we have you, and then later on we have another really fine journalist. You can probably tell that I'm a bit biased. I love journalism. I love journalists. I have to say, I think that journalists tell the story of World War II best. So my favorite books about World War II are by journalists, and yours definitely is going to join the pantheon of really good books that I've enjoyed about World War II. Why did you write this book? I mean, I'm assuming that there were lots of different subjects that you could have written about. What was it about this that really attracted you?
As I mentioned, that this story had been sort of rattling around in my head since childhood, and I actually misspoke for a second there. It was my mother and my grandmother. I had been hearing bits and pieces of my uncle's story from a very young age, and again, I was introduced to Ben's story, became aware of who he was. He had served in the same outfit. I tried for many years, decades really, to write a book on my uncle's story. And I was learning the process of research, learning how to do narrative history. Um, as you know, making that transition from journalism to narrative history takes some time to get better at the craft. And so eventually, when I was, I think, doing it well enough, I started running into from agents and editors. They just felt that my uncle's story wasn't remarkable enough to merit a book that they were willing to publish, one of the major publishers. And so eventually that led me back to Ben's story as a way to tell the story of what the men in the 93rd Bomb Group, what the men who were flying those missions in 1943, those deep raids without long range escorts, to share a little bit about their life and times and sacrifices, all the comrades, all the men who didn't make it back, like my uncle and eight of his comrades. So I knew the vague outlines of Ben's story. And then I spent about a month in late 2021, I believe, drilling deeper to see does this really have the sweep that a book would need. And every day was just an exciting discovery of realizing what an incredible story it was. And so by the end of that month, I knew it was a powerful story that needed to be told and warranted a book.
What always amazes me, and perhaps I'm being a little bit naive, is just how valiant and how determined Japanese Americans were in the European theater, certainly to fight and to prove themselves to be patriotic Americans, if you like. And I think one of the things that your book does is remind us that they did play a very important role, despite the fact that so many of their relatives were interned. The most, as you know, the most decorated US unit of World War II were Japanese Americans. Also, I would add that the highest percentage of any minority group to fight for the United States were Chinese Americans. Um, do you think that we are in an age when the true complexity of that fighting force, the true ethnic diversity of it, is in risk of being not only forgotten but erased?
Uh, yes, absolutely. And let me offer a couple of observations. It's an important point that you made. And you were speaking of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which fought its way up through Italy. And the wonderful historian Art Hansen, who really has been a groundbreaking oral historian in preserving the history of Japanese Americans during the war. Art Hansen says, quite appropriately, Ben Kuroki was the 442nd before there was a 442nd. Um, um, but uh, absolutely. The other thing was some of the men that Ben recruited on his 1944 tour ended up in combat with the 442nd. It's absolutely important to remember these stories. Ben's story had really, I think, slipped from our collective memory. The 442nd, there have been movies made about them, and I think that story has been larger over time and has been preserved. But most of these men are dying away. I've, in the last year, been in contact with one of those wonderful veterans, Terry Shima, who is, if my memory serves me correctly, I think Terry's about 102 now. Um, and it's just tremendously important to remember the sacrifices, both what their families experienced on the home front, the injustice, the loss of constitutional rights, and then what these young men did in combat in Europe.
So I'm going to quote from your book now, and this is from Ben himself. Not only did I go to war to fight the fascist ideas of Germany and Japan, but also to fight against a very few Americans who failed to understand the principles of freedom and equality upon which this country was founded. How do you react to that? It's that's an interesting quote from him.
Yeah, Ben, a couple of things to remember about Ben. Ben was raised in rural Nebraska, so he had um, sort of his essence was rural conservatism, great patriotism. His graduating class in Hershey, Nebraska was 14. So he grew up really not viewing himself as Japanese at all, but he was an American. And so uh, it was very painful, very disorienting, very shocking for Ben when he first entered the army and the racism, the bigotry that he encountered. And then he started to make friends, and he met some really wonderful people as well who did stand up for him and did make sure that Ben got his chance to serve and to fight. Um, but Ben was sort of torn between these two worlds. And it was after he came home from his European tour and was exposed to the camps. And he would later describe driving up to Heart Mountain, which was the first camp that he visited in April of 1944, and seeing the barbed wire, seeing the guard towers, and men dressed in uniforms just like he was, except those men were facing inward, and people who looked like Ben were on the other side of the barbed wire. And that was the first time that that realization really sunk in for him, what was happening. So he was really torn by this. At the same time, he had no sympathy for the draft resistors. Ben's view was very simple. He had a very simple, some might argue even simplistic view of our definition of patriotism. He felt like if people were doubting you, you prove them wrong by serving, and you serve in combat to prove your patriotism. So he said some pretty harsh things about the draft resistors from the camps, and that became part of Ben's story, and particularly late in his life when the stories of those draft resistors started to be told, and Ben came in for some heat.
Yeah, I mean, this is an extraordinary American we're talking about. There were so many exceptional Americans during that war, but he's a very notable example. Um, he fights in the European theater and then fights in the Pacific theater. He's the only Japanese American that did that.
Correct. So you had the military intelligence, the interpreters that were serving and provided tremendous service in the Pacific, were attached to combat units during the island hopping campaign in the Pacific. So those Japanese Americans were allowed to serve and prove their worth again and again and again. They saved lives by interpreting prisoners and radio intercepts and things like that. But Ben was the only combat crew member of Japanese ancestry to serve in the Pacific. There were only about five in Europe and North Africa. And Ben is the only one I'm aware of that was flying heavy bombers, B 17s or B 24s, in Ben's case, B 24.
So I'm going to go to some of the comments now because I've been a bit remiss over the last few months in terms of addressing our wonderful audience's comments and questions. So I'm going to correct that right now. Um, Susan Yu to everyone says they've taken down the 442nd and 100th history from the Army website. Can you believe that? So
I
the,
wasn't aware of that, and if that's the case, that should be rectified. That the 442nd and the 100th Infantry Battalion, which actually preceded the 442nd into combat in Europe, they landed shortly after the Salerno landings in September of 1943, and again immediately proved themselves with their lives, with their blood, with their heroism. And then the 442nd was still in training in the States at the time. And so they were sending replacements because the 100th was losing so many men so quickly in late 43 into early 1944. And then the 442nd finally deployed in the spring of 1944. But their sacrifice, their service should be front and center in our memories.
Absolutely. After all, they are the most decorated unit from World War II. I mean, they do deserve that. Um, Clara, sorry, says, I am an educator and I am extremely concerned about the purging of history. It is extremely important to continue honoring and researching the stories of all minorities that have served our country. Question from Ty, one of our very loyal audience members. What are the details of Ben being sent to the internment camps to recruit? How did that come about? Did military government put pressure on him to do it?
Um, I don't know if I would say pressure, he got orders and he followed those orders. The context of Ben's trip to the three camps in the spring of 1944. So, for a time, um, Americans of Japanese ancestry, those born in the US who were US citizens and therefore eligible to serve, they were ruled as ineligible for the draft, undesirables. And fast forward then to January of 1944, when suddenly it was realized that the 100th IB needed replacements. They needed men. And so the War Department changed the draft eligibility and once again made Japanese Americans eligible for the draft in January 1944. Now, in the camps, you had all these draft eligible men, and many of them, uh, I shouldn't say many of them, some of them enlisted. But by early 44, most that wanted to enlist had enlisted. Uh, and the others were very resistant to the idea until their rights and their family members' rights were restored. And so this draft resistance movement took root in early 1944, and very quickly the War Department was concerned. The FBI got involved, arrests were made in the camps, and eventually several dozen men. Was something on the order of about 50 or so men from Heart Mountain were convicted on federal draft resistance charges and served time in federal prison. So that was the context that Ben was sent there, that the War Department was very concerned. They had this all Nisei unit fighting in Italy, and they envisioned the 442nd playing an even bigger role in the months ahead in the hard fighting, much harder than expected in Italy. And so they needed replacements. And so the draft resistance movement threatened to shut off that flow of replacements. And so Ben was seen as the solution. The first Japanese American combat hero. We'll send him to the camps, and he will deliver speeches and encourage young men to enlist. And some did. But again, he faced great hostility, even some of the draft resistors who wanted to do physical harm to Ben during his tour of the camps. But that was the context in which he made those visits.
So I'm going to complicate things a little bit here because I'm going to ask Max to do us a favor and allow a gentleman, one of our great friends, Don Patton. He feels so strongly that he wants to make a comment. So maybe we could hear from Don just briefly. Oh, I think Max has allowed you to speak, Don. How
Yeah,
are you this morning?
good morning. I want to relate a story that Greg may not know. Uh, back, we've been having our roundtable programs here we're finishing our 38th year. We had Greg up here in probably year 20. I put together his story about his uncle and two ladies here in the Twin City area. That program resulted in both of them writing stories about their relatives in World War II. Uh, I'm I'm disappointed that Greg never got his uncle's story, but the two that he I guess motivated to happen here has had great impact on the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. Thank you, Greg.
Colonel Patton, thank you so much, and for all you're doing to help preserve history with the World War II Roundtable. Just an extraordinary person, Don Patton, and what the work that he's done through the Roundtable. And Colonel Patton, I have to say never, that I have not given up hope on eventually writing and finding a home for my uncle's story. So, Hemingway talked a lot about sometimes there are just stories that you're not able to tell at a certain point in your life. But I think the passage of years and hopefully a little bit of wisdom and more expertise that that I have not given up hope of someday. This is my final mission, my final memorial to my uncle and his crewmates is to deliver that book. So stay tuned, Colonel Patton.
Well, Ruth actually went up on the Italian mountain where her uncle's plane crashed, and the Barbara Wojcik, who has recently passed, I don't know if you knew that.
Yes.
Her book, Bud's Jacket, she took her family of about 26 over. They went to the crash site and then followed the French resistance sites down to the Pyrenees with that. And when I organized a tour to go over to Normandy, we were actually greeted by the rescue crew for the plane crash of her uncle. So your footprint has been indelibly impacted here in the Twin Cities.
Thanks, Don. And I just want to underline the fact that that was an exceptional case. We allowed you to speak in our Q&A because you're such a wonderful, devoted supporter. Thank you, Don, for those comments. EKT says to everyone, Greg mentioned that Ben's comrades lobbied to make sure he got the Distinguished Flying Medal. Was there evidence that he had been denied the award initially because of ethnicity? Can you respond to that, Greg?
Yeah, actually, Ben had received during his combat years 3 Distinguished Flying Cross medals. Everyone who flew the Pulaski low-level raid got one, but he finished World War II with those 3. So the 2005 medal was the Distinguished Service Medal. Now, keep in mind, the Army, Air Forces, Army being the operative word, it wasn't until after the war that the U.S. Air Force was created as a separate service. So Ben was part of the Army during World War II. And so this was the Distinguished Service Medal, which was higher up the hierarchy of Valor Awards.
So, I don't want to keep reading from your book, but I'm sure you don't mind.
Sure.
I think this is, one of the things that I'm always struck with the 8th Air Force, with any of those guys that got into B-17s or B-29s, is just how not only the courage, but just the impact on their nervous systems. And by that, I mean the enormous stress of flying those raids, of knowing that when you woke up in England, for example, that this might be your last day, and then the next day might be your last day. That in 1943, in the 8th Air Force, if you flew a mission in January of 1943, you had a 1 in 4 chance of still being alive by Christmas of 1943. And I don't know whether you gleaned any insight from your research, but how did these guys mentally stay fit to serve? Because that's a death sentence you're living under. You basically know that, and I hate to use this word suicide mission, these two words, it's overused, but literally they were flying suicide missions every day.
Yes. No, you touch on such an important point, Alex, that so the
How do
flight
you
surgeon,
how do you keep it together? I mean, how do you keep it together?
right? And that was a struggle, and commanders, squadron level commanders started to see the effects within a few months in the 8th Air Force. So by December of 1942, the first 8th Air Force raids were flown, very small raids flown in August of 42. By December, they were already starting to see alarming signs of combat stress, of men breaking down. And when they first started flying those raids, they did not have a mission limit. This was uncharted territory. The stress, what it did to a person. I ended up interviewing in the 1990s more than 100 men who flew in the 93rd and 44th bomb groups. The 44th was the second B-24 group to follow the 93rd to England and to assignment with the 8th Air Force. And the men talked a lot about that and the number of weather stand downs. Imagine you're being awakened at 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning. You try to force down some breakfast. You're briefed for the target. You get into the aircraft. You're psyching yourself up to face death. And then there's a weather stand down. And that happened sometimes day after day after day after day. And the exhausting impact of that, of the stand downs, added to the combat experience. Ben would later describe, and I described this in the book, after his first mission, first combat mission, and this was flown in North Africa, he was a waist gunner. The tail gunner was hit in the head, and it was a gory wound. He lived, he survived, but it was terrifying for his crewmates. But they were under fighter attack at that moment, and they could not leave their stations to go tend to him. After that harrowing raid, Ben, for the first time experiencing anti-aircraft fire, for the first time experiencing fighter attacks, his friend lying, bleeding heavily, and unconscious, not sure if he's going to live or die. Ben sank to the ground after that first mission and just thought to himself, I'm not going to survive 10 missions. By the spring of 43, 25 missions was set as a tour. And that's why it was very notable, extraordinary that by the late summer of 43, Ben could have gone home after 25 missions, but he flew 5 more missions. flew 30 missions. They would eventually keep increasing the mission level as the Air Forces gained superiority in Europe. But the combat stress was extraordinary, and we knew so little about the impact on men. Ben, I'll quickly add that Ben later did start breaking down in the spring of 1945 in the Pacific. And they tried to take him out of combat. He begged and pleaded, and he said, "Send me in the crew to Hawaii for some R&R." And so he went back, went to Hawaii for a week, and then in early May 1945 was back in action and ended up flying 28 missions in the Pacific. But clearly takes a toll, and how those men continued to do it. And flying was voluntary. Combat flying was voluntary. You could take yourself off, but it's just a window into the love and comradeship that those men had for each other. And it's sort of patriotism and flag and all of those things are set aside, and it becomes the person next to you, or in this case, the crew unit, which was so close. It was just a transcendent group.
Just quickly, this is Ben. I've had 58 bombing missions now, and I'm still tired enough so my hands shake, and plenty of nights I don't sleep so good. I'd like to go home to Nebraska and forget the war, and just lie under a tree somewhere and take it easy. It's hard to realize that the war is not over for me. Not for a lot of us Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, Negro Americans, Japanese Americans. While there is still hatred and prejudice, our fight goes on. Back in Nebraska on our farm, when I planted a seed, I knew that after a while I'd get a crop. That's the way it was with a lot of us in this war. We went to plant the seeds to bring in a crop of decency and peace for our families and our children. These are beautiful words. These are very important words. And this is a reminder of why history is, I think, this history is more important than ever. Can you comment on that, given the times that we live in today? Why this history is still, and in fact, more important than ever?
Absolutely. I mean, I've loved and felt a passion for history from a young age, and I think it's critical to learn about those who came before us, and I think it's also critical to learn about our country's history, warts and all. I think that's how that we really do reach our greatest potential as a nation, as a people. And so I think that by preserving stories like this, and what I do in the books that I write, I'm not looking to sermonize or preach, but I do hope that people, the things that I write, they reflect, they reconsider, they maybe apply the lessons of those times to the current times in which we live, and to understand, first of all, the struggles, the shortcomings, the triumphs that we've experienced in the past, and how we need to keep all of those things in mind as we navigate the present and the future.
Well, Greg, you're on a mission. It matches beautifully with our mission at Friends. I want to thank you so much for not only a really, really impressive book. I would have nominated it for the Pulitzer Prize. I loved it. You're a damn fine journalist, and thank you for your time this morning, and thank you for your career. I hope you'll come to DC so that we can show you the memorial. It's been a wonderful experience this morning having you share this really beautiful, moving story. Thank you so much.
Alex, thank you.